This video is a response to Brozyme's The Sorry State of Focus video, as well as DE's written rebuttal to it, which he also addressed on his channel. Now, these ideas, I came up with some myself, some from talking to other players, but I thought I'd get them out here and get some feedback on them. So there will be some overlap with things you've read or listened to already, but just bear with me. The increased cooldown unlocked with each new node you make it to feels a lot like you aren't progressing, and I think that's mainly because it doesn't offer a good risk versus reward choice. The risk factor of turning on a new node is just not being able to enjoy what you've unlocked as often. And I think that's a complaint that many players have, and one of the reasons why they'll unlock the things that they want in a given school and then not really spend a whole lot of time worrying about it anymore. And that's just time that players aren't spending in-game doing something that I'm sure the developers spent a very long time working on. Also, some focus schools offer almost objectively better abilities than others, and I'll address this later with my suggestions, but whenever I talk to a player who's just unlocked focus for the first time, they didn't look up what the different focus schools did, and they tell me what they chose, and I may or may not know their playstyle, but I'm thinking to myself, oh, I'm not sure they're going to enjoy this a whole lot. Now that player has to wait to get a focus lens or pay platinum for a focus lens in order to kind of redirect into a school that fits their playstyle more and that they'll enjoy using. Also, it seems like too many of the nodes that affect an activated ability, the focus ability itself, do so in a really minor way. They'll add a % chance for something to happen, or the effect will only linger for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And when you're adding such a large amount of time to the activated ability, each time you turn one of these on, it just is not worth it for most players. In addition, the passive nodes require focus ability activation, which isn't quite what they're advertised as. I know DE is aware of this, maybe they're already working on a way of rewording it, but most of the passive abilities honestly could just be on all the time without requiring activation, and that would kind of address this next point, which is that the activated passive nodes, as we may call them, aren't relevant on some mission types, because as you turn them on, whether you have 1, 2, 3 different passives on, suddenly, okay, rescue missions, I may not use my ability at all. Capture missions, I may not use my ability at all. And I've spent this time investing in something, customizing my character, that I just don't use sometimes. And if I do use it, I use it once, I have the passive ability on, and I move on. There's no reason for me to use it again, because what I've invested my points into, I just use it once, and then I'm done. There also seems to be a decision that has to be made by players between using those passives and improving their active ability, meaning that for any given player, some of the nodes are just never going to be used. You look at a focus tree, you say, oh, this looks cool, but it's usually either the passives or improving the active, and not both, because if you try to turn on both, it's going to make it so you get neither, basically, which is a real bummer, I think, for a lot of players who see things they like and they want to use, but the penalty for using all of the things they want to use is just very, very steep. A disclaimer before I get started: I know that DE has not directly taken player suggestions in a while, and they have their reasons for that, some of which are up on their website, but this is mainly just to get kind of the creative juices flowing in the community, maybe for some of the developers, but just get some changes put in place. Maybe they'll fail spectacularly, maybe they'll be completely imbalanced, but having something different, some more data points that you can adjust from, is always a good thing. Starting out is the Madurai tree. Now, I actually think most of the activated abilities are in a pretty good place. They tend to offer you something that your frame might not have, whether it be bursts of damage or some crowd control. I really like a lot of the activated abilities, but my first suggestion is to put them all on a flat 120-second cooldown. No increases each time you unlock a new node and turn it on, just it's always 120 seconds, so everything you get on top of that is gravy. I have adjusted some of the values, maybe the ability has a bit longer range, maybe it lasts for a bit longer, but you can kind of see those as we go through them. Starting out with the active trade-offs, these are the only things that actually affect the cooldown of the active ability, one of which adds time for a more potent effect, and one of them reduces the time so you can use it more often, but it gives you a reduced effect. For the Madurai tree, my plus 60-second active trade-off causes the ability to deal an additional amount of damage per second equal to the amount of damage the ability has dealt over the last 3 seconds. So it takes a couple seconds for the beam to ramp up, but the more enemies you're hitting, the more damage it's going to do. So you can get a relatively large damage bonus ramped up as you use the ability for a longer period of time. And I think for some of us, a lot of these abilities, we just kind of use them, hit all of the enemies we immediately see, and then turn them off. And this is a way to kind of circumvent that, encourage the player to keep using the ability for that amount of time, which causes them to put more ranks in the base ability. Now, the active trade-off that allows the Madurai's active to be used once every 60 seconds is a little bit different because it completely removes the damage per second from the ability, but gives you a stacking bonus to primary weapon damage for each individual enemy you hit with it for a period of time after the ability ends. Now, I chose primary weapon damage because just an overall damage buff didn't feel right. I like these abilities to be kind of focused. You know what you're getting. You're going to kind of spec your primary weapon so that that bonus works well with it. Now, whether that is a base damage bonus that stacks additively with mods or is added on afterwards is something you can debate, but being able to use the ability more often in a unique way, I think, is a good thing. Moving down to the active augments, these are just the 2 nodes I have that directly affect what the active does. So the first one causes your mods and other things that affect your Warframe power strength to also apply to both the active's damage per second or the buff, depending on which you've chosen. Now, per rank, that increases 200% Warframe power. Seems a bit much, but you can fall somewhere in there and still receive the benefit. The other active augment grants punch through to the active ability and also gives abilities hit by it damage vulnerability that your allies can take advantage of while you're using the ability, and you can take advantage of after the ability ends because it lingers for 10 seconds. Now, you'll note that this augment works particularly well with the active trade-off that increases the cooldown by 60 seconds because it allows you to hit more enemies, and works reasonably well with the active trade-off ability that reduces time because there may be enemies that you miss while you're trying to get that stacking damage buff that you can hit with punch through relatively easily, turn off the ability, and start using your primary weapon. Moving over, this may have been a bit cheeky of me, but I did actually leave in the activated passive for each school, changing it dramatically, but as I thought about it, I really liked the idea of encouraging players to use their active ability a lot. Whatever customization they had on it, encouraging them to, turn it on for at least a couple seconds when it's off cooldown. So this activated passive grants a % damage bonus to melee weapons for the remainder of the mission for each minute of cooldown incurred. And you'll notice this templating on all of the abilities. And that's because you don't want to penalize a player who's chosen to have their active have a longer cooldown or a shorter cooldown. So as long as they're using it when it's available, they'll gain the same damage bonus regardless. There's a damage bonus cap per level. It goes up to 500%. Again, I don't think that's super outrageous because it would require you to use your ability while it's on cooldown for 100 minutes straight, which most players aren't going to be in a mission for that long to get the full benefit of the passive. Jumping over to the two passive abilities, these are abilities that are active all the time, regardless of whether or not you've used the active ability. The first increases all impact, puncture, and slash damage dealt by weapons and Warframe abilities by 8%. Now, this is a bit different than the way the Madurai tree currently works, where each one of those is separate, and it just looks at the weapon's damage and increases it. If your weapon doesn't deal much puncture damage, this passive wouldn't increase it by very much. But if it deals a lot of a particular type of damage, it's just a nice overall buff to IPS, where a lot of people get most of their damage from elemental effects, just based on the way the mods work right now. The other passive increases all fire damage dealt by weapons and Warframe abilities by 1%. I think fire is a bit overlooked. I really like it. There isn't one of these for each base element, and I know Ember has a similar ability, but having those two stack could actually cause some pretty interesting things to happen. And this also encourages players to not just always use dual elements when one might suffice, and encourage them to try some other mods as well. Jumping up to the next node, these focus translation nodes exist in each school as I have them, and are basically a way to show that you've mastered that school while using another one. You can rank them up like any other node, but they're only active when you're not using that school, and they all affect the active abilities of other schools. So for this one, it says, while Madurai is not your active way, your focus ability also deals some amount of damage per second to any enemy caught in its range. Finally is the capstone node. Now, capstones aren't a new thing in any game with tech trees. They're basically where you can put your points after you've unlocked all of the other abilities in a tree. So what this one says is that your weapon's fire rate is increased by 1% per 100,000 focus you invest in it, capped at 100% extra fire rate, meaning you would need to put 10 million focus into this capstone. I don't think that's outrageous, just given that players play the game a lot, and some of them will just only use one school, and this gives them something to do. It takes a lot of time to get that much focus, and you always feel like you're progressing that way versus just finding the school you like to use and never really diverging from it and hitting a brick wall once you've unlocked everything that you want to unlock. Next, alphabetically, we have Naramon. I really love the flavor of this school, the idea of knowing your enemy, using their strengths against them. Right now, it kind of has a bad reputation with some players for fundamentally changing the way the game is played. People just running around invisible, slashing at everything with an adder axe or their preferred weapon. And I don't want to remove that gameplay. I want to bring the other schools and the other ways of playing up to that level so that players can feel good, can feel powerful, play difficult missions, kill high-level enemies. That's what a lot of us want to do. So again, I didn't adjust the active ability on the Naramon way very much, but we will get to the things I changed a little bit down the line. First, the two trade-offs. I have the active trade-off that adds time, increasing it to a 3-minute cooldown, increasing the cone eventually to be a 360-degree aura that not only confuses enemies, but disarms them. So Radial Disarm Loki is pretty popular, and giving this ability to some players on a 3-minute cooldown means they'll get it once, maybe twice on a lot of missions, and I think that's fine. The active trade-off that reduces the cooldown just slows the enemies instead of confusing them. This is something you'll probably just pop on for a second or two, slow the enemies, either move around them or start attacking them while they're having trouble attacking you. The first active augment I have causes any enemies affected by your passive to deal and receive an additional % damage to anyone but you and your allies. So if you confuse a bunch of Grineer, they'll all start attacking each other and take and deal additional damage, but if it's a crossfire mission or a fisher where there are different enemy types, I want them to all just kind of fight amongst one another. It makes the confusion effect, I think, a little bit better in terms of dealing with high-level enemies with armor, because right now you have 2 Grineer units shooting at each other, it's not going to do a whole lot. The other active augment causes all enemies affected by your active to have their armor and maximum shields permanently reduced. This deals with what I was just talking about, and it gives players a way to deal with high-level armored enemies aside from going in a team with corrosive projection, or always using high-status, high-fire-rate weapons with corrosive bias in order to deal with those really large, effective HP pools of Grineer units, corrupted units, some infested units. So for those players, this would be an option for them to customize their loadouts differently without having to worry about enemies having a ton of armor, because they could go with the reduced active trade-off. Once every 60 seconds, hit a large area, permanently reduce their armor and shields by a particular amount. Now, I know a lot of Naramon players really like to see big numbers, and that's cool. So, for the activated passive on this tree, I have a flat critical damage increase. Again, whether that applies on top of all of your other critical damage or as an additive percentage, I'm not sure, but the really big numbers kind of come as you play a mission for a long time, just like any other activated passive. In order to get the full bonus, you're going to have to use your ability every time it's off cooldown for 100 minutes in order to get this, but when you do, I think it would be a lot of fun. Moving over to the passives, the first one looks a lot like Maiming Strike. It increases critical chance of all weapons by a flat amount. I think this could really give some new life to weapons that don't have a great critical chance, but have a decent critical multiplier, and just can't be redeemed with mods by themselves. We're talking about things like the new core, but you're not really going to hit red crit territory, which is probably a good thing for some of those weapons. I feel like the only time you should be seeing a new core red crit is when you're using a Kavat. The other passive is a variation of the much beloved or maligned, depending on who you are, node in the Naramon tree that grants invisibility upon inflicting a melee critical. Now, I did like Brozyme's recommendation on this in one of his videos, where he just said having you be visible every once in a while would probably fix the ability. So you'll notice here that there's just an extra clause that says it can only occur every so often, and what this means is you'll be invisible and getting those really big damage numbers a lot of the time, but every once in a while enemies are going to see you, you might have to dodge, get behind cover, rethink your strategy versus just turning the ability on and going for it. Up to the focus translation, while Naramon is not the active way, any other focus ability marks enemies in a similar way to Helios or Banshee. I don't know exactly what that ability is called for Helios, but causing you to shoot points on enemies that you normally don't shoot is a fun mechanic, and just having it as an additional thing to spice up some of your focus abilities, I think would be a lot of fun. Lastly, we have the Capstone ability. This capstone increases radiation damage dealt by weapons and Warframe abilities by 2% per 100,000 focus, capped at 200%. Radiation to me is kind of the Naramon element. Not only does the active ability in the Naramon school cause confusion, radiation is one of those elements where if you want to do a lot of just base damage to some enemies with a lot of health, that's what you use. Just like with fire in the Madurai tree, I think that encouraging players to use different elements, to try different things and see what works for them is a good thing, and having a 200% radiation damage buff might encourage some people to use it over gas or corrosive in some situations. Moving alphabetically to the third focus school, we have Unairu, proving that DE really has a love for the end of the alphabet. The petrifying ray on Unairu's active can feel kind of underwhelming, so the one main change I made on the active here was to cause the enemies to turn to stone very quickly, over 1 second. Jumping to the active trade-offs, the one that increases the cooldown time to 3 minutes causes any allies struck by your attack to have their armor increased by a flat amount and their max health increased by a flat amount. I know that Vazarin is kind of the support healing school, but for me, Unairu, being able to tank, to take a lot of damage, giving that to your allies is a lot the same. It allows you some breathing room to do what you need to do, while your allies kind of take that mantle for a little bit. The active trade-off that reduces the cooldown causes it to be an instant flash, much like you'd expect a basilisk in a lot of mythology to be like. Just instantly, everything in front of you in a cone is turned to stone, and you move on. A lot of players might like that because a lot of players don't like channeling their ability for 20 seconds. The two active augments I have kind of work together in a fun way. The first one causes any enemies turned to stone by the Unairu ability to die instantly upon taking a certain percentage of their health in one hit. If you think about stone sometimes being brittle if it takes a hard impact, that's kind of the idea here. The other active augment would cause your allies' effects to inflict your active's abilities effect for a particular amount of time that would refresh if you continued channeling that ability. These two work together in a really fun way where your first bullet would turn an enemy to stone, and then the second one, if it did enough damage, would just instantly shatter who you were firing at. The activated passive I have for the Unairu school is just flat armor. Now, this causes some fun things to happen with what I would call borderline armored frames. So frames that have somewhere between 80 and 130 armor that you can put a steel fiber on and get more tanky than some frames, but really just never feel great to get shot with, like Inaros or Valkyr. The passive abilities, the first one increases melee and thrown weapon damage by up to a percentage based on how slow the weapon's attack speed is. There are some thrown weapons that I don't see used, partially because their attack speed is slow or their damage is slow. Now that kind of fixes that, but what it also does is encourages people to use slow weapons. A lot of times the goal with a melee weapon is to speed up the attack rate using a combination of Fury, Berserker, and some other mods so that you can hit a lot of enemies quickly. But being able to hit single high health, high armor enemies for a lot more damage with a heavy weapon could encourage people to use weapons like the Fragor or the Gram more often than they do right now. The focus translation ability for Unairu I have causes enemies to be rooted. If you're not familiar with that terminology, a root is an ability in a game that causes enemies to be unable to move but still perform all other actions. The capstone ability for Unairu that I have improves your companions. Again, I know this is maybe a bit of the wheelhouse of Oberon with his passive, but the combination of increasing your armor with things like Link Armor and Link Health, those mods that go on companions, and increasing the damage of your sentinels by a not insignificant amount, again, gives players options, allows them to vary their loadout and try things that can be a lot of fun. Next up is Vazarin. The main change I made to the active ability is just granting more health and shields. Enough health and shields that while you channel the ability, it makes your allies reasonably difficult to kill. And this is one of the things I think that the Vazarin school really wants to do, where right now it doesn't do it very well, is provide just very, very good support on demand for you and your allies. Jumping to the active trade-offs, the first one increases the cooldown to 3 minutes, but increases the range of the ability to affinity range. So rather than covering 25 meters, it's going to cover all the way up to wherever your allies are in a reasonable distance. It also causes it to grant 25 energy per wave. I sprinkled in a couple extra plus energy abilities because I felt like having the only relevant energy restore being in Zenurik sometimes limited player choice. The other active trade-off I have is the minus 60 seconds, which reduces the amount restored and the number of pulses that restore health and shields to your allies by 50%, but causes them to all happen very quickly. Now, this is just basically a quick burst, tops everybody off, but works reasonably well with one of the active augments that we'll get to momentarily. Before we get to that, though, I'm going to cover the buff that I've added to the Vazarin school. Warframes affected by your active would gain a certain number of seconds of a buff. Now, if you hadn't figured it out, I am terrible at naming things, so I don't even have the names of the focus abilities in here, much less coming up with the name of a buff or the names of these nodes. But what it would do is grant 50% incoming damage reduction and a certain amount of health regeneration per second to you and your allies. The other active augment that I alluded to causes shields granted by the active ability to be able to create an overshield for you and your allies. Not a whole lot in the game gives overshields, and unfortunately the values have to be reasonably large to compare to the amount of HP you have when adding in armor, whereas shields just take full damage. The support flavor I added to this active augment causes any warframes with overshields granted by that ability to gain status immunity until they go back to normal shields or lose their shields entirely. The activated passive is connected to the active augment in this tree because it's a combination of the current activated passive in Vazarin of giving you instant revives with kind of allowing whoever you've revived to have a bit of extra survivability for a brief period of time to kind of get out of harm's way. A lot of times, once someone's been downed and people come in to revive them, all of the enemies attacking those people have clumped up and there's just a ring of death. So helping people get out of that could be a real good thing. Coming up on the first of the two passives, status effects have a reduced duration on you and also deal less damage where applicable. Things like a corrosive proc on a warframe aren't going to deal damage, but things like gas and slash, two of the quick killers in high level content, even through high shields or a moderate amount of health and armor, would deal a bit less damage while this is your active school with that node unlocked. The other passive reduces shield recharge delay and increases your maximum shields by a flat amount. Now, shield recharge delay is something that can confuse some players. They'll see something like fast deflection, put it on their warframe, and wonder why there's still a long wait between when their shields deplete and when they come back. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's an easy way to implement this in the game because I don't know how the code works. The Vazarin focus ability is the other thing in the Vazarin tree that restores energy, but it restores energy when you're using any school but Vazarin. You also restore some health and shields per second while you're channeling some other school's active ability. And lastly, we have the capstone. Now, Vazarin doesn't feel like a school that has a huge number of offensive options in terms of nodes, but this one adds it in kind of a sneaky way and in a way that doesn't necessarily have to diverge from being a support frame, but could if you wanted it to. And it's simply increasing your weapon's status chance by a certain percent per 100,000 focus. Now, I feel like since this goes up to 100%, it would need to be an additive bonus versus a flat bonus, because otherwise some silly stuff could happen with things like the twin Grikadas. Lastly, we come to Zenurik, and we're going to jump directly over to the trade-offs. The one that increases the cooldown by 60 seconds also increases the incapacitation duration by 50%, and causes allies caught within the range of your ability to deal guaranteed electric procs on their attacks for a particular length of time. This is, again, just a little love and shout out to a base element that isn't used as much, at least that I see, as most of the elemental combos. The active trade-off that reduces the cooldown to a minute also reduces the incapacitation duration of the ability, but increases it gradually to an aura where you don't have to be aiming around to hit enemies on all sides of you. The first of the two active augments causes the first number of enemies to be struck by your active ability to fight for you for a short period of time in a similar manner to what Nyx does, while the second active augment grants you and allies within affinity range a certain percentage power efficiency for twice the incapacitation duration. And this is the reason why the two active trade-off abilities also change the incapacitation duration, because if you're going to wait 3 minutes for your ability to cool down, you want a little bit of that extra efficiency time as well. The activated passive I have for Zenurik increases power range by a percentage for each minute of cooldown incurred, which just allows for this kind of gradual, organic Warframe ability improvement over the course of the mission if it's a longer mission. The first of the two passives is everyone's favorite. It's just flat energy regeneration per second. For frames that really feel like they need some sort of energy vampire, energy siphon effect, this frees up some mod and or team slots. The other passive does two things. The first one causes any of your weapon attacks to have a % chance to inflict an impact proc, which is basically just a stagger, and the other half allows you to see enemies through walls. I think this would allow for some really fun stuff to happen if you're stacking punch through, whereas right now just a small amount of punch through is what most people build in order to hit a few enemies that they can see in a line. For the focus translation, it's a bit of a play off of the second active augment that causes any allies caught within range to have their power strength increased by 30% for 15 seconds. Note that you can't have both of these, because the focus translation would only be active if the Zenurik school was not active. The capstone is just a maximum energy increase per 100,000 focus invested. It synergizes well with the passive and could free up the flow slot for some frames. This would also have the incidental effect of improving quick thinking survivability for frames that prefer to use quick thinking. Those were my complaints and suggested fixes for the focus system in Warframe. If you have any comments, suggestions, or critiques of your own, please let me know in the comments below. I do like the focus system and what it adds to the game, but I don't feel like in a lot of cases it's supremely impactful unless you choose one of a very few builds. So I hope everyone that stuck through this has a great day, and I may be releasing more in the future.